Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you were here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The History of Racism by our own Forecast Radio. We're on chapter 13, but I want you to remember the lessons of chapters 11 and 12. They only understand violence. And it's nothing more evident than their understanding of violence than their decision today regarding Carmelo Anthony. See, they believe that he should be punished even though he was defending himself in that situation. And you have to be cognizant of the fact that your self defense is a crime to them. And you have to be aware and understand that in their system of law, there is no justice for Black people. We are the only ones that are the arbiters of our own justice. And we have to mete it out as we see fit. And we have to do whatever we can to hold on to the freedoms and liberties that we have fought in this country to have and uphold in this world. And we have to do whatever is necessary in order to ensure that our children inherit a world where they enjoy the same, if not more, liberties and freedoms than we have. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Chapter 13, Manifest Destiny, the Dred Scott Decision. In 1841, Frederick Douglass gave his first speech about abolishing slavery to an all-white audience. We often talk to other audiences when we could be talking to ourselves. Not long after Frederick gave his first speech, an anti slavery newspaper reported that he was racially profiled and kicked off a train. Things were getting so bad for free Negroes that Ohio reinstituted laws to deter whites from kidnapping Black people. You recognize that that's a constant theme, that at the point that Black people are free and living independently and autonomously from white people, they begin to kidnap us, and then laws, which won't be enforced, have to be passed so that they feel better about the fact that they're doing something about the problem, but it's still not solving the Negro problem, which is the problem of free Black people in a country that was organized to be a white nationalist country. Many poor whites, especially immigrants like the Irish, tried to make money by selling free Negroes into slavery. They often blamed their problems on Black people and were increasingly violent since the riot of 1829. Lynch mobs even attacked white abolitionists who they referred to as nigger lovers. They burned printing presses for anti slavery newspapers and attacked and murdered several Black men and women and children as well. But they were attacking the Black business owners. They were attacking Black men in positions of power and influence in their community because, in their mind's eye, if you cut off those that are able to generate economic revenue and opportunity, then you are destroying and dismantling the community as a whole. These problems weren't only in Ohio. In DC, a free man named Solomon Northup was kidnapped and sold into slavery for 12 years. He went on to write the book 12 Years a Slave about his experience, which the movie was based on. Meanwhile, in Illinois, Abraham Lincoln won a court case to free a young Black girl. In Bailey versus Cromwell, Lincoln argued that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 outlawed slavery in the state. The court agreed that selling the enslaved girl was illegal. Essentially, it meant all Black people in Illinois were free, in theory. Although Illinois was technically a free state, Texas was still acting as its own nation. They reinforced laws against slaves, especially runaways. And you have to remember that in this country, the worst thing you as a Black person can do is run from the authorities. They feel like when you run, they have the right to chase you down. And that goes back to the Fugitive Slave Act, because if you were running away from slavery, they had the right to chase you down, to hunt you down, and to kill you, and to return your corpse to your owner, and the state would settle the bill. White citizens not only had the right to catch runaways and turn them into the police, it was their responsibility. If a slave couldn't be returned to their plantation, they were put on the auction block to be sold because they became property of the state. Greetings, Nicole, day by day. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. In Rhode Island, 60% of the white population still couldn't vote in 1841. Many white immigrants, mainly the Irish, didn't own land, which was a requirement to vote. When a white gay guy named Thomas Dorr led a movement to expand voting rights, Irish immigrants excluded Black people. The Dorr Rebellion failed miserably after adding a whites only clause. Dorr led his followers to take over the city's arsenal, but it was guarded by some of his family members. When the guards refused to surrender, he tried to fire a cannon, but it didn't work. He became a laughingstock and was eventually arrested. He was the first to be convicted of treason against the state, but Dorr wasn't lynched or punished. In fact, he was out of jail by 1845. The same year, the Amistad victims were exonerated. A man named Madison Washington led one of the most successful slave revolts. Madison was born enslaved in Virginia, but managed to escape to Canada. However, his wife was still enslaved, and he realized it would take too long to buy her freedom. He felt that his freedom was nothing without his wife, so he decided to return to Virginia to save her. Since she was unable to escape with him, he stayed in Virginia to be near her. Eventually, Madison returned to Madison returned to Canada, determined to free his wife. With the money he earned, he bought weapons and concealed them in his clothing. Since he was still wanted, he hid his identity and traveled at night to avoid being recognized. Madison ended up stumbling across a corn shucking where slaves were rewarded for peeling large amounts of corn with a feast and whiskey. After being stripped of everything, they found any reason to uplift their spirits, so they often sang and danced during the corn shucking. Madison blended in and asked a few questions, but didn't eat any food for fear of being recognized. He found out where his wife was, but he was so anxious to see her, he was spotted by an overseer. The first three white guys who approached him were knocked unconscious. Eventually, enough backup arrived to subdue Madison. He was shipped to Richmond, Virginia, to be sold in the epicenter of interstate slave trading in America. Madison was sold to Johnson and Epperson and was set to be shipped to New Orleans. He and 144 others were heavily shackled and placed on a ship called the Creole. Knowing he still had weapons in the lining of his clothes, Madison cooperated as he was chained to the floor. The conditions on these slave ships were no different from any other slave ship, with men held in one cabin and women and children in the other. Additionally, they were They were facing in one direction. They were in very close quarters. You could feel the person in front of you and behind you. So these were not comfortable quarters. On the ninth day of the trip, Madison finally saw the right opportunity to strike. Using a saw and other weapons he had concealed, he was able to break free. He freed 18 others who he thought would help, and they attacked the ship's crew, catching them by surprise. They wanted to kill them all. And here's where humanity betrays us. But Madison wouldn't allow it. He even got crew members medical treatment. Once they healed, they tried to regain control of the ship but failed. Madison was named captain of the ship and he ordered the chef to prepare a feast to celebrate their freedom. Although he wanted to go to Sierra Leone, it was too far. He ordered the surviving crew members to take them to the Bahamas where slavery was outlawed. 116 people were freed as soon as they landed. 5 of them chose to stay on board and return to slavery in New Orleans. When the ship arrived with only 5 people, their enslavers were infuriated. They demanded that Madison and the others be returned. However, since slavery was outlawed and there was no extradition or treaties between Britain and America, they remained free. Madison Washington and the men who helped him fight were arrested. However, in 1842, the court ordered that they be released as free men. Madison freed himself from slavery twice after risking it all to free his wife. The second time, he was able to free over 130 others, including his wife. There's a reason we know about the Amistad case, and there's even a movie about it, but we rarely hear about the Creole case. The victims on the Amistad had to ask, "Give us free." But in Madison's case, he took freedom and led one of the most successful slave revolts. Even though his previous plans failed, this true hero and warrior didn't give up and helped free many others without knowing his wife was on board the Creole. Not long after the Creole case, a ruling in another court case deemed the federal government responsible for slave catching. The case Prigg versus Pennsylvania essentially created federal agents out of slave catchers. It began when a slave catcher named Edward Prigg kidnapped a Black woman named Margaret Morgan and her daughter. After Pennsylvania passed laws against kidnapping and selling free Blacks into slavery, it was more difficult to take runaways out of Pennsylvania than anywhere else. Prigg followed procedure but didn't have enough evidence to remove Margaret and her children from the state. After he was denied, he took them to Maryland against their will anyway. Prigg was arrested, charged, and convicted under the anti kidnapping statute. He appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing the state's right to protect free Negroes didn't supersede the Fugitive Slave Act. The court ruled federal law overruled state law, and Prigg's conviction was overturned. The court also ruled that slave catching was the responsibility of the government, and they could no longer force white citizens to be on slave patrols if they didn't want to. Whether the slave patrol was federal or not, it didn't matter to slaves trying to escape. In 1842, a free man named William Wells Brown led a group of 69 runaway slaves to Canada. William had already escaped slavery and used his experience working on steamboats to help others. Some felt leaving America was their only hope. In Rhode Island, Voting rights were extended to any native born male, including black men, if they met the age limit. However, poll taxes prohibited, and prevented many Negroes from voting. Rhode Island also excluded the Narragansett tribe because they were darker skinned people. Now, isn't that something? Yeah, forecast says shout out to Madison, Washington. Down south, Georgia unanimously passed legislation to declare free blacks were not citizens of America. Many states, especially free states, focused on protecting the personal liberty of white citizens. In states like Ohio, New York, and Vermont, whites were no longer persecuted if they didn't join the slave patrol, although it was still illegal to give slaves refuge. Inspired to make a change, Sojourner Truth escaped slavery in New York. She changed her name and became the first Black woman to join the anti slavery lecture circuit. Meanwhile, in Indiana, Frederick Douglass was beaten by a white mob. White crowds felt violence would deter abolitionists, especially Black ones, but they refused to back down. At the National Negro Convention in Buffalo, New York, Henry Highland Garnet gave his most famous speech, A Call to Rebellion. He suggested instead of trying to convince or sway whites to grow a heart and end slavery, Black people should take their freedom by rising against slave owners. Henry also said, neither God nor angels or just men command you suffer for a single moment. Therefore, it is your duty to use every means, both moral, intellectual, and physical, that promise success. Although he was referring to a boycott and not necessarily killing, many, including Douglass, saw it as extreme. Frederick Douglass spoke out against Henry's speech and condemned it at the meeting. Henry responded, but he was eventually voted against. Henry favored the idea of leaving America and he eventually moved to Jamaica. There, he continued to fight against the system and preached about establishing separate sections in different nations for Black people. Meanwhile, in 1844, James Polk was elected the 11th President of America and was the ninth to own slaves. Polk became a slave owner as a child and even purchased several slaves, including children, while in office. As president, Polk pushed the idea of manifest destiny, a term coined in 1845. They believed America was destined by God to spread its dominion across the entire continent. They felt God had given them the right to take the land and enslave the people. Congress also lifted the gag rule set in place to stop petitions on abolishing slavery. States like Connecticut continued to pass personal liberty laws to protect white citizens who didn't want to participate in the slave patrol. Oregon decided to outlaw slavery in the state completely, but they also didn't allow Negroes to live there either. However, North Carolina completely denied citizenship to all Negroes in 1844. Many free Negroes were forced to leave the state. Some were even enslaved. At the, as the issue of slavery became more complicated, the Underground Railroad continued to grow as more people tried to escape. A free Black man named William Still helped as many people as he could reach freedom. In Florida, a white abolitionist named Jonathan Walker helped several slaves escape to the West Indies where slavery was illegal. Walker was ultimately arrested and convicted. He was sentenced to be tied to a pillar and publicly branded as a slave stealer. But since Walker was white, he wasn't executed or treated the same as a black abolitionist. In 1845, Texas was finally admitted into the Union as a slave state after repeated attempts. And although manifest destiny was an American concept, the same thing was taking place globally. The British convinced leaders of the Fanta people to sign the Bond of 1844. At least 8 chiefs signed the bond, giving the British control of the land. Some saw signing the agreement as a signing away of their sovereignty to foreign powers, but the Fanta people felt it was better to be controlled by the British than the Asante Empire. And what they're saying is that I would rather be a white man's servant than a black man's servant. That's what they're saying. The British didn't respect the Asante culture and wanted access to the land. They took advantage of tribal issues and formed an alliance with the Fante people in order to do so. Dating back to 1806, conflicts with the expanding Asante Empire led to the first Asante-Fante War. The British used their war to gain access to the land and capitalized as both sides exchanged captured prisoners for guns and other goods. So, what he's saying here is that they enslaved both people on the boat. So, even though they may have been enemies on the land, once they hit that boat, they were one people because they were all being enslaved. The Akan people who were sold into slavery were known as the Coromantee. The Coromantee led many revolts and caused fear in Europeans. It was one of the factors that played into the slave trade being banned. The Akan people used indentured servants themselves to clear land, but it wasn't close to the chattel slavery Europeans practiced. Still, as Europeans expanded the Gold Coast settlement, remember they settle in with social, sexual, and economic integration. The Asante and the Akan tribes traded indentured servants and prisoners of war to the British. In 2006, Ghana apologized to the descendants of the slave trade for the role they played. The Asante tribe fought as well and defeated the colonizers on some occasions, including in the Anglo-Asante Wars. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Britain declared control over Natal. They also gained control over Zulu land after the Zulu king Dingani died in 1840. Although the land was given to the Boers, the white South Africans, the natives continued to fight back. As the French continued to expand on the Gold Coast, they built more slave forts, including the forts of Assini, Bassam, and Debu. The French got the chiefs of local tribes to sign treaties which allowed them to make the area a permanent trading center. Back in America, free Black citizens in New England created the Freedom Association to aid runaway slaves in 1845. That year, a man named Macon Bowling Allen became the first Black person to pass the bar and practice law in Massachusetts. In entertainment, a Black man named William Henry Lane, aka Master Juba, was considered the first famous Black performer in America. He was one of the first Black people to join the minstrel shows. William wore blackface and made fun of himself in front of an all white audience. And although Black entertainers were paid, they weren't even allowed in the building unless they were performing. Even then, they still had to use the back entrance. After Florida and Texas were finally admitted into the Union as slave states, a columnist named John O'Sullivan helped Polk coin the term manifest destiny. It didn't matter that people already lived on the land. America felt it all belonged to them, from sea to shining sea. To take California, Polk invaded Mexico after they refused to give up their land. Before Congress declared war, the U.S. offered Mexico $30 million to buy New Mexico and California. However, Mexico was still upset Texas was part of America. They didn't have enough resources or manpower to stop the US from taking what they wanted. So eventually, Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. The treaty ended the war with the US, but Mexico ceded nearly 55% of its land. Can you imagine giving up over half of your country because you're dealing with a monster? Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. So they gave up over half of their land. America received California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado in exchange for $15 million, plus another $5 million to pay the claims of American citizens. Mexican citizens in those territories were only left with the option of leaving or becoming American citizens, which would mean they were subject to the laws and taxes of America. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo alone helped expand the idea of manifest destiny. One U.S. representative wanted to push the Wilmot Proviso to ban slavery in the newly acquired territories. However, the Senate rejected it. Instead, Texas's state legislature created a formal slave patrol system. These slave catchers, also known as paddy rollers, eventually grew into the modern day police. The first slave patrol was established in 1704 in South Carolina, but by the 1840s, it had reached another level. Meanwhile, in St. Louis, Michigan, a Black man named Moses Dixon founded the Knights of Liberty in 1846. The Knights of Liberty was a secret organization that planned to organize a national uprising to end slavery. The plan was to recruit slaves from the South and train them to prepare for an attack within 10 years. Within those 10 years, the organization grew from 12 men to nearly 42,000 people, with every state except Texas and Mississippi. Although they were fighting for their liberation, Moses ordered them to spare the women and children and to treat their prisoners well. In a fight for liberty and liberation, I want you to remember this: you can spare no quarter. You cannot spare anyone, because they will grow up with the idea that they will either grow up with the idea that you slaughtered their fathers and have vengeance in their heart, or they'll grow up with the idea that there are preferred people with special privileges and the same system that you dismantled will be reinstituted because they will feel that they need to be in this preferred position. You can spare no quarter in the fight for liberation if you're going to take that route. Moses and the others expected over 200,000 people to join them by the time they reached Atlanta. But after setting a date for the uprising, it was called off because people expected the Civil War to happen at any time. Still, the organization became part of the Underground Railroad and helped many escape slavery. Although New York passed more laws to abolish slavery in 1846, Missouri repealed the laws against interstate slave trading. The next year, Missouri even passed laws to forbid free Negroes from reading, writing, or getting an education. And that's something that I think the boomer generation was aware of, that the knowledge that they did not necessarily pass down to Generation X moving forward was that even as a free person with money and resources, you were not allowed to read, write, get an education. And really, if you showed them that you could count, you might be in jeopardy because how could they cheat you? So you had to be cheated in commerce, you had to be cheated intellectually, you had to be cheated in land purchases because you couldn't read or write. So, how could you acquire land? How could you obtain a deed to the property if you weren't allowed to read or write? You couldn't even make your mark. Or maybe you could make your mark, but you didn't know what your mark was being assigned to. You didn't know what rights you actually had. And that's something that my mother's generation was aware of, because when the housing market crashed and we were suddenly able to move into these white neighborhoods that had been closed off for so long, except for to the extremely wealthy Black people, when the working class Black person, the plumbers and carpenters and teachers and things like that were able to move into white neighborhoods and upset the balance of power. One of the things my mother said was that now we can buy things that we always had the money for, but that were denied to us because they couldn't protect those land covenants that they had, which kept land in white families and in white communities. Because some of those deeds, it was written into them that it can only be sold to a white person and that it couldn't be sold to a Negro, an Indian, an Asian. These things were written into the deeds. And if they prohibit you from reading, writing, or getting an education, they prohibit you from accessing the information that says you can't buy this land. But continuing. Over in Africa, Tanzania officially abolished slavery in 1847. Slavery in Tanzania dated back to the trans Saharan slave trade. Those are the Arabs, which happened way before the Atlantic slave trade. That year, Liberia declared itself an independent nation and became the first democratic republic in Africa since colonization. They created their own constitution, although they received approval from America. A Black man from Virginia named Joseph Jenkins was elected the first president of Liberia. Elsewhere, Sweden abolished slavery in 1847. Back in America, Pennsylvania finally began enforcing the anti kidnapping personal liberty laws for free Blacks. The U.S. House of Representatives also passed the Oregon Bill. The bill outlawed slavery in Oregon so Texas could remain a slave state. Still, despite the odds in Chicago, David Jones Peck became the first Black person to graduate from a medical school in America. Another black man named Robert Morris Sr. became the first black lawyer to file a lawsuit, and he won. Robert was also the first to challenge segregated public schools in Roberts versus Boston in 1848. It was considered the first legal challenge of separate but equal, although the Supreme Court ruled against him in 1850. As Robert challenged segregation, a slave named Dred Scott was challenging the system in his own way. Dred was born enslaved in Virginia and was moved to Alabama before being sent to Missouri. After his enslaver died, he was purchased by John Emerson, who moved him to Illinois before taking him to Wisconsin. There he met an enslaved woman named Harriet Robinson and married her. Since Illinois and Wisconsin were free territories, Dred had the right to make a legal claim for freedom, although he never did. Eventually, Emerson moved back down south, and Dred was sent back to Missouri. After Emerson died, his wife Irene Emerson leased Dred until he learned about his right to claim freedom. He offered to buy his freedom along with his family's, but Emerson refused his offer, using the doctrine of once free, always free. Dred and his wife filed freedom lawsuits. A Missouri law passed in 1824 said slaves were to be freed after living in a free state for a certain period of time and could remain free even if taken back to Missouri. Despite having legal standing, Dred and his wife were denied freedom by the courts. See how their laws and their justice do not deliver us justice? It's just us, y'all. It's just us. The court claimed since he couldn't prove they were owned by Irene Emerson, he couldn't sue for freedom. Dred was granted a retrial, but it was delayed until 1850. During the retrial, he and his family were granted freedom. But 2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court stepped in and overturned the decision. Left with no choice, Dred took his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. However, 7 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court had been appointed by slave owning presidents, and at least 5 judges came from slave owning families. Eventually, they ruled against him in a 7-2 decision. Dred and his family were sent back to slavery. The court's opinion, read by Chief Justice Roger Taney, was that Negroes were not included and were never intended to be included under the word citizens of the Constitution. They said Negroes couldn't claim any rights, privileges, or protections for American citizens. Using laws dating back to the Constitution, Taney said there was a perpetual and impassable barrier intended to be between the white race and the one they reduced to slavery. Taney also claimed both free and enslaved Negroes were beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. He said Negroes were so inferior that they had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. To this day, no law or court ruling has officially overturned the Dred Scott decision. That is why Black people still fight for civil rights that American citizens already have. For example, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 still has to be voted on and renewed every 25 years. The Dred Scott decision also ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. The court added Congress had no power to say which state could allow slavery or regulate it, but it was up to the state. The Dred Scott ruling essentially ended the debate on where Black people stood in America, if there was still any question. So, as you can see, we have to assert our personhood constantly and be reaffirmed constantly in the eyes of the law. We don't have the right to defend ourselves. That's why Carmelo Anthony is going to jail. We don't have the right to defend ourselves against law enforcement. That's why resisting is a charge that every time you get stopped by a police officer, they try to tack on to your case that you were resisting arrest. So you have to look at it that way and understand that their system of law does not produce justice for us. Chapter 14, Fugitive Slave Acts, The Great Escape. Unlike Dred Scott and Robert Morris Sr., not everyone attempted to get their freedom through the courts. In 1848, about 70 slaves tried to escape from slavery in Washington, D.C. on a ship called the Pearl. After 2 days of rough weather, they were captured on the Chesapeake Bay near Lookout Point, Maryland. All of them were sold and shipped further down south to Georgia or Louisiana. Many were taken to the New Orleans slave market. White residents were outraged over the attempted escape and rioted for 3 days. They attacked abolitionists, publishers for promoting anti-slavery propaganda. The white abolitionists who helped them escape were charged and convicted. They served 4 years before they were pardoned. That year, states like Rhode Island, Vermont, Connecticut, New York, and Ohio passed more personal liberty anti kidnapping laws. However, these laws were meant to protect white citizens from being forced to capture runaways more so than to protect free blacks. While South Carolina was busy removing laws against interstate slave trading, gold was discovered in California. Many people moved out west hoping to get rich. A large number of people were caught up in the California gold rush, but slaves were doing anything they could to get to freedom in the North. An enslaved married couple, Ellen and William Craft, escaped from slavery in Macon, Georgia. They arrived in Philadelphia before eventually moving to England. Ellen was the daughter of a white slave owner and an enslaved woman. Although she was still considered a slave, she was three-fourths white and noticed that she could pass as a white woman. Eventually, her father and owner allowed her to marry William, who had more freedom than other slaves. William was often rented out, but was allowed to keep most of the money he made as a carpenter. William and Ellen wanted to start a family, so they saved money and planned their escape for Christmas of 1848. Ellen knew she could use the fact that she could pass as white to pose as a slave owner traveling with her slave. Since white women generally weren't allowed to travel alone, especially with a male slave, she cut her hair and dressed as a young white male. Ellen pretended to be deaf so she didn't have to talk to anyone. Since she couldn't read or write, she tied her arm in a sling so she wouldn't have to sign anything. They covered her face in bandages to hide her skin, and she kept glasses on to hide her eyes. Still, William and Mary had several close calls. They traveled first class on trains and stayed in the nicest hotels. They figured that they'd hide in plain sight. During their journey, Whites warned Ellen about being too nice to her slave and told her to make sure he didn't escape. At one point, Ellen even sat next to a friend of her owner and father, but he didn't recognize her. During the last major stop in Baltimore, Ellen and William were detained until she showed proof of ownership for William. Maryland was the last state many slaves went through before reaching freedom, and it was heavily guarded. When the authorities refused to let them go, William said he felt they were in deep water and were being overwhelmed. But as the train was about to leave, for some reason, the authorities changed their mind and let them pass. They made it to Philadelphia on Christmas morning after the 4-day journey. Ellen and William became popular telling their story, but it led to more slave catchers trying to hunt them down. After stricter fugitive slave laws were passed, William and Ellen left Boston for England. There, they had 5 children, all born free. 20 years after the Civil War, they returned to America and opened a school for Black children in Georgia. In 1848, slavery was abolished in Denmark. France had also abolished slavery in its colonies and granted full voting rights. Black cities were able to elect their own representatives. But in America, the institution of slavery was still in full effect. Although his strategy was different from William and Ellen Craft, Henry Box Brown was determined to get his freedom by any means. Henry was born near Richmond, Virginia, and married an enslaved woman named Nancy. They had 3 children, but since Nancy was enslaved, so were their children. Henry paid Nancy's enslaver so he wouldn't sell her or their children. Eventually, Henry was betrayed. After coming home from working in a tobacco factory, he discovered his wife and children had been sold. Not long after, he had the idea to mail himself to a free state. Stuffing himself into a box that was 3 feet long, 3 feet deep, and 2 feet wide, Henry cut out a small hole for air and only took a few biscuits and some water. To get out of work, he burned his hands to the bone with oil of vitriol. Henry was transported in the box by wagon train, steamboat, by wagon, train, steamboat, another wagon, another train, a ferry, and another train before being delivered to Philadelphia. Although the box was labeled "Handle with care, this side up," the box was flipped and tossed around several times. At one point, Henry was flipped on his head for about an hour and a half. Although he almost died, Henry was able to stay quiet. After traveling for 27 hours, he finally reached freedom. Henry said it was worth the risk to get his freedom. But after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he moved to England. There, he met his second wife, a white woman named Jane Floyd. You know, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that some Black people who lived their lives as slaves found curiosity, interest, and sexual desire in other white people. That baffles me, having lived your life as a slave. Like, a it's different. A black person that can pass is still black, right? But maybe that's also some form of fetishization that we have toward them. I don't know. Harriet Tubman escaped slavery herself in 1849. She was one of the most famous freedom fighters and helped many enslaved people escape north. She got to Philadelphia from Maryland by herself. And within a year of gaining her freedom, Harriet got word that her sister and children were going to be sold. She said she was happy to be free, but her family deserved to be free with her. Not long after, she went back to Maryland and led her sister and her two children to freedom. Still, Harriet wasn't done. She went back again, this time for her brother and anyone who wanted to go. The third time she went back, it was for her husband, but he had already taken another wife and refused to go. She left him there, but took anybody willing to go with her. Harriet went back a fourth time for her parents, and she kept returning to free as many people as she could. Eventually, she was given the nickname Moses because she led so many people to freedom. Each time she returned, Harriet improved her techniques to stay hidden. She used codes, blankets, and songs to communicate. Harriet often left on Saturday nights because the news of missing slaves wouldn't be printed until Monday. She even carried a drug to keep babies quiet around slave catchers. Harriet was also known to carry a pistol, not only for slave catchers, but for anyone who wanted to turn back. She said, "You'll be free or you'll die." Harriet wouldn't allow anyone showing weakness to put everyone else in danger. Harriet famously remarked, "I must have freed 1,000 slaves, but I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves." She returned at least 19 times to free as many people as she could, when most others wouldn't return once. Harriet became the most wanted person in America. A $40,000 reward for her arrest was issued, equivalent to more than $1.2 million today. But no one ever dared to turn in Harriet. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, Harriet began taking people to Canada because more slave catchers were going into free states. In California, the population grew rapidly after the largest unforced migration in America to date. As the gold rush changed the West, the California state constitution banned slavery completely. However, states like South Carolina, Missouri, and Kentucky lifted bans on interstate slave trading. Virginia's legislature passed a law allowing slaves to be freed by will or deed. But remember, free blacks weren't allowed in the state. So once you got your freedom, you had to leave. In Philadelphia, the black population rose as more slaves escaped between 1849 and 1850. It wasn't long before white mobs started attacking them. To reinforce the institution of slavery, Missouri's legislature passed a resolution saying states should have the right to decide if slavery was legal or not. The Compromise of 1850 allowed California to enter the Union as a free state, but it allowed New Mexico and Utah to vote on legalizing slavery. The compromise banned slave trading in D.C., but Maryland removed restrictions against interstate slave trading, with Maryland being the last state before slaves reached freedom. Many blacks were shipped further down south. By 1850, the U.S. Census, the seventh U.S. Census, showed America had a population of 23,191,876 people. Negroes made up about 15% of the population, with 3,204,303 Black enslaved people, compared to only 434,449 who were free. Many states, like Virginia, passed laws requiring free Blacks to leave within a year or face reenslavement. In Brazil, the government declared the country would no longer participate in the slave trade. Anyone caught participating was subject to piracy charges. Although chattel slavery was slowly being abolished globally, America strengthened its slave codes. Since so many enslaved people escaped to the North, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, doubling down on the Act of 1793. The law required all runaways to be returned to their owners. Despite personal liberty laws, the Act of 1850 required average white citizens to be part of the slave patrol again. Some called it the Bloodhound Law because of the dogs they used to track down people. Anyone who refused to arrest an escaped person was punished, in addition to a $1,000 fine, which is about $30,000 today. Even if someone was suspected or accused of being a runaway without evidence, they were forced to arrest them or face punishment. If a Black person was accused of being a runaway, they weren't allowed to testify on their own behalf or have a jury trial. So this goes back to the idea that Black people in white spaces don't belong. They have been epigenetically changed to believe that Black people don't belong in white spaces. Because if you were a white person and you didn't report a Black person in a white space or in your space acting free, you could face a fine of up to $30,000 in today's money. That's interesting. Judges were compensated for sending people into slavery, whether they were a runaway or not. Aren't judges compensated today for sending people into the prisons, whether they're guilty or not? Don't they get kickbacks? For every person they sent into slavery, they received $10, but they were only paid $5 for every person they released. If a white citizen was caught aiding a runaway by giving them food or shelter, they could face up to 6 months in prison plus a $1,000 fine. And make no mistake, finding $30,000 today is hard because you would have to tap your 401k, your future earnings. That's difficult. But even finding $1,000 today is difficult because there is a National Pew Research poll that says the average family could not withstand a $500 emergency, let alone a $1,000 fine. Just think about that. And think about what that meant for people at that time. to be looking at $30,000 in debt or $1,000 in debt. Bread is 2 cents or 5 cents a loaf. Anyone who captured a Black person was given a bonus. The updated Fugitive Slave Act led to Black men, women, and children being kidnapped even more than before. The Fugitive Slave Act also led to the price of slaves rising, especially in border states. Many free Black people were forced to leave America and go to Canada. About 300 Black Seminoles moved to Mexico from Texas because slavery was already banned there. One of the first victims of the Fugitive Slave Act was a free man named James Hamlet. He worked as a porter in New York, but a white guy from Maryland named Gustavus Brown accused him of running away from his mother's plantation. You see, and that's what I'm talking about. White people could just say you were their runaway slave. They didn't have to have any paperwork or documentation. If they did have to have paperwork or produce documentation, they could forge those documents very easily. So this Gustavus Brown guy accused him of running away from his mother's plantation. James wasn't allowed to testify or speak for himself. There was no evidence that James was a runaway, but he was sent to the Maryland slave market to be sold. After pamphlets telling his story were published, James was able to return home after about a week. Many people, including Frederick Douglass, used his case to condemn the Compromise of 1850. The tension was so high in America, riots exploded. The Christiana riot of 1850 started after Edward Gorsuch, a slave catcher, went to Pennsylvania looking for 4 runaways. Gorsuch considered himself a good slave owner, but had to hire 3 slave catchers to help him. He went to the home of a free Black man named William Parker looking for information. William was a runaway himself and led a Black self-defense organization to help others escape slavery. When the 4 men heard Gorsuch was looking for them, William offered them shelter and protection at in his farmhouse. When the slave catchers arrived at William's house, his wife sounded a horn to let them know they were there. When people heard the alarm, supporters of both sides came running with weapons. Although it isn't clear, most likely one of Gorsuch's supporters opened fire first. Anywhere from 50 to 100 people in Williams' self-defense group showed up. The 4 men the slave catchers were looking for refused to be taken, but Gorsuch refused to leave without them. Gorsuch was one of the first to be shot. His son was also shot when he ran to check on Gorsuch, but he survived. Slave owners in the area were furious and demanded the Fugitive Slave Act be enforced to set an example. Over the next few days, white mobs attacked the Black community. However, the 4 men were already gone, and William went to Canada with the help of Frederick Douglass. A grand jury indicted 38 people on 117 charges, including treason. This was the largest number of people charged with treason at one time in U.S. history. William's white neighbor was also charged for helping the men escape, but he was acquitted within 15 minutes. The Christiana riot happened not long after Sojourner Truth gave her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Sojourner Truth's speech described the experience of a Black woman in America. At the same time, Harriet Beecher Stowe began publishing Uncle Tom's Cabin, although it wasn't released until 1852. Stowe was usually published in anti slavery newspapers, and although white mobs attacked offices where anti slave propaganda was published, Stowe's writing continued to gain popularity. Meanwhile, slavery was officially abolished in Colombia in 1851. The next year, the Hawaiian Kingdom abolished slavery. However, back in America, Texas passed a law to compensate slave owners for any enslaved person who was executed after committing a crime. Vermont passed more personal liberty laws despite the Fugitive Act, but it was only to protect white citizens. However, many vigilance committees were created to help free Negroes. The Detroit Vigilance Committee helped 1,200 Black people get to Canada. On the 4th of July, 1852, Frederick Douglass gave his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" The first live performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin also took place that year in Troy, New York. Slave states not only banned the play, but the book was banned as well. If anyone was caught selling Uncle Tom's Cabin, they were thrown in jail if they weren't killed. The book was based on real characters and described the Black experience, but it also displayed the courage of people like Josiah Henson. Although in modern times, Uncle Tom has become an insult, Josiah escaped from slavery with his wife and family. His right ear had been cut off after beating up a white overseer for brutally assaulting his mom. When Josiah and his family reached Canada, he started his own settlement. He even built an integrated public school, which was unheard of. Over time, Josiah helped 116 people get to freedom in Canada. With the continued success of Uncle Tom's Cabin, other books, such as Solomon Northrop's book, 12 Years a Slave, were published. Regardless of all the anti slavery literature, an Illinois court case, Moore versus the People of the State of Illinois, made things tougher for slaves. The court ruling created a statute making it illegal to harbor a runaway slave or prevent them from being captured. Although Illinois was a free state, they passed laws to forbid free blacks from entering the state. However, the Supreme Court in Oregon ruled any black person brought into the territory would be declared free. Although slavery was abolished in free states, free blacks weren't treated any better if they were allowed in the state at all. In Connecticut, a white person named Prudence Crandall was arrested for conducting a school for black girls. One of the black codes made it illegal for black children from another state to attend school in Connecticut without permission. But that didn't stop black people from educating themselves, even if they had to move to Canada to do it. In Ontario, Mary Ann Shadd became the first black woman to publish a newspaper. By 1854, Venezuela and Peru abolished slavery. In America, as Harriet Tubman led more people to freedom, the Kansas Nebraska Act was passed. The act repealed the Missouri Compromise and restricted slavery above the Mason Dixon line. It also gave states the right to decide if they'd be free or slave states by voting, which they called popular sovereignty. Connecticut and Rhode Island decided to pass more personal liberty laws to protect white citizens. However, more people were being charged under the Fugitive Slave Act. In Wisconsin, a free man named Joshua Glover was charged with being a runaway and sent into slavery. In Boston, a man named Anthony Burns was also charged and sent into slavery. So they have been charging us with crimes and sending us into slavery for over 100 years. By 1855, an estimated 4,000 former slaves moved to Mexico, mostly from Texas. All Black people wanted was a chance to protect and provide for themselves and their families. In Massachusetts, segregated schools were abolished after the court case of Roberts versus Boston. The case started after a free Black man named Benjamin Roberts sued the school system. His 5-year-old daughter wasn't allowed to enroll in an all white school because she was Black. The court ruled in the state's favor and said there was no constitutional basis for the lawsuit. Massachusetts, Maine, and Michigan passed more personal liberty laws, but had no interest in protecting Black residents. Down south, Georgia and Tennessee repealed laws against interstate slave trading. In Kansas, the first election over slavery was held in 1855, but in Ohio, John Mercer Langston, the grandfather of Langston Hughes, became the first Black person elected to serve in the government. The next year, James Buchanan was elected as the 15th president of America. Buchanan briefly owned slaves and called the issue of slavery a matter of little practical importance, but in his of little practical importance in his inaugural address. For slaves, however, no other issue was more important. An enslaved mixed race woman named Margaret Garner escaped slavery with her family. After they were caught, her husband shot back at the slave catchers. He hit one of them before he was overpowered. Instead of being sent back to slavery, Margaret tried to kill herself and her children. However, she survived, along with 3 of her children. After the longest fugitive slave trial on record, they were eventually sent back into slavery. In Kansas, as tension built, a white mob destroyed the town of Lawrence. In response, an abolitionist named John Brown led what was known as Bleeding Kansas. He and 6 others killed 5 members of the mob. The fighting in Kansas continued for years. In 1856, Congress passed a law denying Negroes the right to buy property on public land that had been fixed up by the state. However, the next year, laws in New Hampshire and Vermont mandated that no Black person could be denied property based upon race. Vermont also abolished laws that forbade Black people from joining the militia. In Richmond, Virginia, things were much different. Enslaved people were forbidden from smoking, carrying canes, or being able to self-hire, which means you couldn't find your own job. You had to have a white person supervising you in order to make money. The slave codes also forbade one Black people from using provoking language or menacing gestures around a white person. They also weren't allowed to go into certain parts of the city or stand on the sidewalk if it inconvenienced a white person. If a Negro walked past a white person or a white person passed them, they were forced to step off the sidewalk. They called it street etiquette. Several states, including Kansas, passed more personal liberty laws, but only to protect white citizens. In 1858, Kansas officially entered the Union as a free state, despite much debate. One of the more famous debates was the 7-part Lincoln Douglas debates. Abraham Lincoln argued against slavery, saying the Democratic Party wanted to dehumanize the Negro. Although his argument was anti slavery, it was clear he thought the black race wasn't equal to whites. But Lincoln felt the justification of slavery would eventually be used against poor whites. By 1859, white workers in South Carolina petitioned the legislature for laws to save them from competing with black people for jobs. Eventually, it led to the creation of racist labor unions. Many poor whites had a hard time finding work because they were less skilled than enslaved people. Also, slaves were much cheaper than paying a white person. Many slave states even called for the slave trade to be reinstated to meet labor demands for cotton. Poor whites resented black people even more and blamed them for all their problems. They didn't realize they were on a plantation as well, just in a different way. So as you can see, poor white people are the ones that are really the most dangerous to black people because the employer class, the billionaire class, the wealthy white people, they employ us, they manipulate the situation, they pit the poor white people against the poor black people. This is not an excuse or opportunity to link arms with them because at the end of the day, they weaponize their whiteness against us and they weaponize aspects of the system against us. But this is just to show you that there's more risk, there's more at risk for us from poor white people or white people that have tried to claw their way into the middle class than there is to fear or be apprehensive about from actually wealthy white people. Because actually wealthy white people feel like if you have enough money to be here, then you belong. But if you don't have enough money to be here, then you wouldn't be here. Poor white people feel like I belong in this place and I have a right to the quiet enjoyment or the nigger free environment that I have created for myself. The forecast says judges are still paid more for convictions than they are for freeing for freeing prisoners or the convicted. And that's definitely something to think about because in this system that we currently reside under, judges are paid more when they incarcerate someone. They are paid less and they are put in a position where they are asked about quotas when they don't incarcerate someone. So, what did you guys think? Greetings, forecast. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you clear. Can you hear me?
Oh, hold on. For you, it's not you, it's me. And
Oh,
also,
yeah, well, I hear you clear.
try it now.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, well, yeah. So first of all, I want to shout out to you for doing this. Like, I definitely appreciate your reading and your interpretations and all of the stuff that you added in there. You see, I was fair. You know what I'm saying? I included the quote unquote good white people they talk about. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I still don't understand how living through slavery, you could have any sexual desire toward a white person. Do you understand? Like, like I don't understand that mindset. Like I don't like, maybe it's that Eldridge Cleaver thing where you want to dominate and possess his woman because this is your way of interrupting their bloodline and dominating and possessing them. But I don't understand that.
Yeah, yeah. You talking about that brother who escaped slavery just to marry a white girl,
Yeah.
and I think that it has to do with an inferiority complex, and it things is this. If I lighten my child will have a better chance with lighter skin, probably, and a fear kind of thing, and a inferiority complex. I think has to do with it.
Mm. Well, I know that's definitely what went on in other generations of us, like in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. Like in the modern era, that's a problem because I want my baby to have good hair. So I'm going to get me a non black man or a non black woman, or I want to mate with a non black person because I want my child to have opportunities and I want them to be pretty because a lot of us are brainwashed into the idea that there's this standard, this Europeanized standard of beauty that is beautiful, when in fact we are the beauty standard. We set the standard. We are the ones that are the original blueprint for what is beautiful.
No, absolutely. That is facts. That is facts. But you still got to realize, like coming out of 1840s, 1850s, like they're coming out of slavery where all they know is Negroes or the N word were
Hmm.
slaves, you know what I'm saying? And maybe, just maybe, but it didn't work, you know what I'm saying? We know that now, but
Hmm.
I also can't blame them. But also, it's like Frederick Douglass, went through all of that and then married a white woman, you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So. But
Yeah.
I don't know, because Negroes are still marrying white girls to this day, so I can't tell you why. I don't know. It's a
And I
curse, I
feel
guess.
that there should be some level of discounting of some of the things that they stood for because they decide to marry out. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like they should, like, even in modern movements, if you marry out and you stay married out, you should not be allowed to lead a movement. Like if Abraham Traore was married to a white woman, I would feel so betrayed by him. Do you do you know what I'm saying?
No, absolutely, because at the end of the day, there comes a time where you're gonna have to make a decision, your family or your, and why even put yourself in a position to make that decision? And you're gonna be weak on it, and you're gonna create a person with, like, not to blame. That's what makes it complicated, because it's not to blame the mixed race child, because in American context they're slaves, but in France's context they're the slave owners. You know what I'm saying? But
Mhm.
it creates a whole complicated dynamic to where you have a split personality, as Raw would like to say, two personalities, one body. You know what I'm saying? And
Mhm.
split alliances. Like even with this like with the Asian boycott, you would see Blasian black people. Oh, we can't really boycott, and this is not, trying to reason with it. You know what I'm saying? But it's split allegiances. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. 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 They have a mixed allegiance because they have an allegiance to their white side or their non black side, and they have an allegiance to their black side because that's where all the cool stuff is at. That's where all
Exactly.
the cool stuff is.
Yeah, and that's why, like, even with the ones who is, they in America, they rape their own daughters and stuff like
Yeah.
that. The young girl whose sister who escaped, or mulatto sister who escaped with the brother, she was being molested by her own daddy, who was her own slave owner. You know what I'm saying? And she wanted to escape slavery, and it is what it is with their story. But and the brother shipping himself to freedom and stuff like that. um
Hmm. And there was a lot of that happening where they were molesting and sexually assaulting their own daughters, and it was almost the like a fetish with them. And even in the modern era, every like we have sexual assault that happens in the black community, but it's usually not a father. It's usually a stepfather, a uncle, or a cousin. I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying that that's usually the way it goes. There are some instances, like there's a girl I saw the other day on Facebook where she was talking about she had 4 children by her father, but she was not a native born African American. Her father was a foreign national, like he was a foreign black. But with every white person I know, they talk about their fathers and grandfathers sexually assaulting them. So they do it in the modern era, even to their own children and grandchildren. Whereas with black people, it's usually at least a little bit removed, where it's like an uncle or a cousin, you know, or a stepfather. And this is not to minimize in any way, shape, form, or fashion the seriousness of this conversation, but they've been doing that. They've had this perversion of going back into their kin for generations. They have that fetish.
No, yeah, that's their culture. Like if you look it up, like their stuff, like the little girls had to dress like little boys to avoid like different stuff, but then they're attracted to little boys, so
Hmm.
it's like weird, you know. But like even what you saying, it's like you was like not to minimize like what you were saying, because in our community it happens way too often where it's like, oh, my aunt's boyfriend did this, and then the aunt blamed the
The little girl.
child. Yeah, because I seen that
Hmm.
way too much. But and to be fair, I did see one instance like where like my first girlfriend when I was like young, and I believe it was her biological father, but he could have not been from here now that I think about it. But um he did that to his own biological daughter, which is like crazy to me, you know what I'm saying? And I should have done a lot more. You know, I was like 14 at the time, you know what I'm saying? But I definitely should have done more. But yo, that whole thing goes back to even that culture of like what you was reading on the last time about the slave farms, and how you was forced to do certain things, and the whole baby, like they like to say that because everybody does that, because I don't really believe in that baby mama baby daddy stuff. But you see like where black men was forced to have as many children as they could, black women was forced to have as many children as they could, and the black family has always been under attack. But it's always been a sexual perversion that
Hmm.
they have like really enforced, that's a whole nother scale of it, you know what I'm saying? Like, so yeah, all that is wild, you know.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree. It's almost, and then like they watched, like let's imagine they're putting these bags or these sacks over our heads to force us to have sex, right? Who's guiding the people into the position to commit to have sex, to copulate? Who's guiding them in that position? And who's watching this happen? Right? And then the man has to get sexually aroused. Like, from my understanding, an erection doesn't just happen. You know what I'm saying? Just because you near it or whatever, whatever. Like, there has to be some type of engagement. So, are they pumping them? Do you know what I'm saying? To get them prepared and then putting them in a position and then pushing them, and then they're watching this action happen until completion, and then they're checking to make sure that it's finished. Like, there's this whole culture that's perverse around slave breeding that doesn't get talked about.
Well, yeah, yeah, because that's true. Like I didn't even think about it on that level, and it's like they had like weird things where they would have like just orgies in the house, you know what I'm saying, just for their entertainment purposes. And you got to think most of the, well, a lot of people would be related, or you know what I'm saying, like, and for them, like, yeah, they would why like they often preferred the black women to their own women, and they would watch it. And then like what's undersold is like, especially when they be talking about that gay stuff, like how many of these slave owners was just gay and doing that to little boys, you know what I'm saying? And making little
Hmm.
boys do that to each other. And yeah, they absolutely like picked who was going to be with who, you know. And for them, it didn't matter if you was related or not. It was like it mattered if you was a quote unquote bull, you know what I'm saying, for them, you know what I'm saying, or a buck, you know, like. And I don't know how they did that, you know what I'm saying? I think they also like they often like they did use drugs and stuff like that, because a lot of plants and stuff like a lot of weird stuff was going on. But yeah, and often like you would be punished if as a male you didn't perform, you know what I'm saying? You
Mhm.
could get castrated if you were like a lot of times what they did with the other males, they would make them dress up in dresses on these breeding farms and castrate them and make them show off the women, you know what I'm saying, on like a pimp kind of like thing. You know, it was evolved into that whole pimp culture stuff, you know what I'm saying?
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, all that stuff is, but that's a part of European culture. Like we can't even fathom some of the stuff that they do, you know?
Exactly. And it's insane that there were cultures at that time that preferred to be under Britain or European domination and rule rather than partner with other African nations like the Fanta people that you wrote about. Um, and that they would rather go with the unknown foreigner who's rumored to eat the people that they take away than they are to make peace with the Fanta people, the Asante people that they've had this long-standing war with.
Yeah, like that's a well, that's a part of how we keep getting enslaved because we fight each other, but somehow we welcome the pale face in, or we be like, "Oh, that's the good ones," and then especially at this time, they and also they were under the threat of having their own people enslaved or tortured, but then they was like what they would use is deception and stuff like that, but it worked throughout the generation. It works today, you know what I'm saying? We
Mm,
still argue about tribalism and to this very day, like whether it be the FBA thing or whether it be the South African thing or whatever. You see, they like, well, the white South African is more a part of us than you are, and that I don't understand either. But that's what Europeans have learned to capitalize off of our internal um beef, our fear, and all of that stuff combined, and then offer you the gun, as Khalid Muhammad, the guns and the weapons and the drugs and the alcohol, and step back and say, look at what these people are doing. You know what I'm saying? Like
mhm.
that's just what they do. You know?
Yeah, it's crazy how we continue to fall for the same tricks over and over and over again. It's like a repeating cycle. Um, and like you said, the South African thing or the FBA thing, where they feel that they have more in common with these white interlopers, these white interrupters of their lineage and history, these white people that came and settled into the land than they have with other African people or African American people, which makes them feel further alienated from the land that it should be our birthright.
Yeah, facts, facts. And I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to say something about a couple of things that you
Mhm.
read. First of all, I'll be saying however too much, but I'll fix that in the next one. But I'm glad to see that now from like an outside perspective, you know what I'm saying? You know how it'd be when you be
Mhm.
all wrapped up. You don't even but no, yo, Madison Washington, first of all. Yo, besides Ida B. Wells, who is like will be in the next part, but Madison Washington's story, yo, he stick out for me a lot, you know what I'm saying, where this brother freed himself from slavery, went back into slavery to free him, well, went back to free his wife and got caught and ended up freeing 100 and some people. And then like six of them or seven of them went back because they were so afraid, and this brother ended up doing it. Like I always wanted to make like I know people tired of slave movies, but I think like a movie like about Madison Washington is important, and I also think it's important that they have a movie about Armistead where the dude like give us free, but they don't tell you about Madison Washington who like yo I'm gonna take my freedom and go back and get my wife and family. You know what I'm saying? And I think
Mhm.
Madison Washington is an important brother. You know what I'm saying?
I
Um,
agree. I absolutely agree. I think that we need more movies about slave rebellions and we need more movies about people that actually freed themselves. because they put that and leave that information in books, right? Because they don't like the optics of Black people freeing themselves and liberating themselves. They don't want to put that image out there. But in this age of AI, and in this age of we can produce the movies on our own, without the help of a studio, if we're not looking to get paid the big bucks for it, we're just looking to get the content out there, then I think that would be an excellent project for someone to work on, the
Yeah,
story of
ab-
slave rebellions. It would be
yeah,
nice
yeah,
if we could be paid well and handsomely for it, but they don't want to pay us well for
yeah.
those types of liberation stories.
But that's the thing, like, and that's something that we can control is like, what's your dot with our dollars? Like, we cannot support stuff that is to our detriment and support
Hmm.
things that is to our benefit. Unfortunately, like they get paid like Kanye West said, a white man get paid off of all of that. You know what I'm saying? But yo, and oh yo, that's another thing that you brought up was the Yo, one thing that was interesting that when the brother was paying the white dude to keep his wife, to not sell his wife and children down the river, but he sold them down the river anyway. And that's the brother Henry Box Brown. He was paying the slave owner not to sell his wife. And I just was like, the image that shows of us, you know what I'm saying, is black men paying another man not to sell your wife and children, you know what I'm saying? Um,
Absolutely. I think that understanding, they always want to vilify Black men historically and in the modern era. But Black men stand by their woman. They stand by their children. Real Black men. There's this fuckboy persona that has been propagated throughout the masses right now, that has been allowed to run rampant in the community. But that's only been something that's been an issue for a generation or two, like going back to the 80s. And those Black men went to jail. You know what I mean? Like, those Black men went to jail because even when they were paying women to put them in out of the household, they still didn't necessarily leave. They did what they did in Claudine, where they hid the presence of a man. To they may not have gotten married, but they hid the presence of a man. They did not allow that to stop them from getting the benefits that they were entitled to. James Evans would have been around the 60s and the 70s, would have been a father in the household around that time, unemployed, seeking employment for himself and for his family, you know. And this Black man is no different from Black men in the modern era that wanted to make sure his family was together.
no, that's facts. And you know what the crazy part is? Nobody got more welfare than white girls, but
Hmm.
they didn't have to kick out their husbands, you know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? But
Hmm.
as for black people, we did, and I try to put it in context because even if you go back to James Evans times, like you got to realize, like at that time, that was right after they built the highways right through your neighborhoods. There was no employment. Yo, black unemployment was sky high. And then when you look at, you have a pregnant wife with a 2-year-old baby that's crying, that's hungry. And these people, like, now I don't agree with it because we looking at it in hindsight, but you have somebody like, hey, and you got to think what the projects would have looked like brand new, as opposed to what they look like today. But they like, we'll give you a house, we'll give you food, we'll give you this and that. All you have to do is leave that no good N word behind. He ain't no good anyway. You know what I'm saying? And of course, after centuries of negative propaganda, which they've always done to split the black man and black woman, like you gotta, I understand where it comes from, but so many brothers and sisters didn't fall for it that I can't give it a pass, but I understand.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you have to remember is that we're never falling for their tricks. We're always manipulating and moving within their system. So, we don't believe the propaganda of Black men and Black women are marrying out at these higher rates, or the rise of the mulatto or things like that. Because really the most common pairing is a white man with an Asian woman, right? Um, Black men marry black women if they marry at all. You know what I'm saying? It's just that so few, it's that black women have been educated to the point where they feel like so many black men are not eligible to be married, that they have discounted a whole generation of men. And those men are fighting back with the manosphere, and they're frustrated and sexually frustrated and upset. So, there's this idea, they educated her, they incarcerated him, and that has brought the biggest divide, I think. Um, but when they release him back into the wilderness, if he did what he was supposed to do while incarcerated, because you get an out date, if you went to school, if you made a business plan, they will help you do all of those things while you're in prison so that you have an executionable plan when you get out. If you keep your nose clean and keep your head down. I'm not saying that prison is the right way to be institutionalized. I'm saying that if you happen to fall into that situation, that there are programs and different things you can access so that when you come out, you definitely have a strategy to move forward instead of falling back into the same pattern of being a prison.
No, that's facts, yo. Cause and yeah, the dating game is all screw, and I know that is done intentionally. You know, they all already be talking about that depopulation stuff, and it's only because they can't populate. But um, of course, they don't want us, because one of the biggest things is the black family of the, like, because all of that stuff led to, like, from like black people standing together to the 60s where they did all these things economically. Then they hit you in the 70s with the feminist thing, and then the 80s with the crack epidemic, you know what I'm saying, which totally destroyed like all of our communities, you know what I'm saying. And like you said, they boost up, not boost up, but give a fake a prop up to like black women, to where like, yeah, most educated, but like, what does that really mean? And then on the flip side, as a black man, like, that all of the stereotypes about you is that, what I'm saying, you're a danger to the police and all of this stuff, and you don't want to get, but yeah, a lot of all of that stuff is like fabricated because we look at it from a European lens. There's a whole lot of black, just young black men who would marry a good black woman, what I'm saying, and who would never date another type of woman. You know what I'm saying? But the society and the standards and the norms on both sides got men looking for certain things in a woman, and women looking for certain things in a man that wouldn't necessarily fit us as a whole anyway. You know what I'm saying? And then on top of that, you got to take in the economic portions, and then like what you got to do to maintain your job, and then paying all your bills, and then like a whole bunch of things on top of that, you know what I'm saying? But I blame them for all of that stuff, for real. But it's still up to us to create institutions, like you said, like, because my brother Bakari always be like, why make things for people in jail, which I think we should. I agree with you 100%. That's your warrior class, you know what I'm saying? But
Mhm.
also, don't neglect the young brothers who's in high school doing the right thing, and create programs for them too, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I always respected that he said that, said stuff like that, you know what I'm saying? Like, because yeah, we need to have programs, because that's the problem. If you don't have your youth and your young warriors, they need your youth to be locked up, to be working. Like they said, the prison population is getting older. We need some young bodies to work these fields. You know what I'm saying? I guess they're trying to get back into cotton and sugar or whatever, but they're trying to lock young brothers up.
Well, with them getting rid of the immigrants, right? With the migrant population being under attack because of ICE, they need somebody to go pick the fruit.
Yeah, facts. Yeah, facts. It's chain gangs.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings it back to the other thing you brought up, right? And I'll try to put it all together with this last. All right, so you it was like the Dred Scott thing, right? And you brought up something that was more important earlier with the young brother Carmelo Anthony who defended himself. And we all know what happened, you know. So you get on the same week them sending you a message like, well, this Chinese or Asian or whatever you call them,
Mhm.
dude shot a young brother, not guilty. A young brother defends himself, guilty. You know what I'm saying? It's exactly what they're trying to tell you, and it's no different from the whole thing with Dred Scott, and they tell you time and time again, like it was laws before Dred Scott and after Dred Scott that says you are not a citizen, and we have no intention whatsoever of you having citizenship. You know what I'm saying? And the Lincoln Douglas debates, you know what I'm saying? Why they call it the that's why they even call their presidential debates that, because that's where the Negro question was born. You know what I'm saying? What are we going to do with these Negroes? Because like with the poor whites, yeah, they are the most violent, but even the ones that they call abolitionists one day, it's because it affected poor whites, you know what I'm saying? Because they like, well, they just hiring slaves for much cheaper, and they're way more skilled. So they start creating these labor unions, you know what I'm saying, to make sure that you can't hire a young black person. And that's what a lot of these the push for this ending slavery came from, like. And then the Lincoln, what he was saying was like, yeah, we need to get them out of here for real, you know what I'm saying? And like because they could be a danger and we don't need them around, you know what I'm saying? And that's I believe that's why they have the question in every presidential debate about all of their policies and all that stuff. But then one question in every debate, at least one, is what are we going to do with the Negroes? As far as, because they just say, oh, what, as far as African Americans go, what do you feel about reparations, or what do you feel about the Civil Rights Act, or what do you feel about whatever we're doing at the time? Is always separated, you know what I'm saying? And we don't see that we're not citizens. So of course you're not gonna get justice in their court systems, you know what I'm saying? But then like that's why I say shouts out to brothers like Henry Highland Garnett, who was like, yo, we gotta do what we gotta do because we ain't gonna get justice in our system, in their system, you know what I'm saying? And like Harriet Tubman said, she said, "Yo, you'll be free or you'll die." You know what I'm saying? And we've been dying because we ain't free. So, but
Mhm.
yeah, I'll stop there.
Oh no, you're fine. I appreciate the perspective because one of the things that we don't talk enough about is like, are we even living truly free? Like, I am of the mindset that we are still on the plantation, no matter what you do, whether you have a corporate job, a plant job, whether you anything other than an entrepreneur, you are unfortunately still on some type of plantation. Um, and even as an entrepreneur, you're still placating to, unless you have a strictly black product, you're still placating to a white audience because that's where, unfortunately, in America, the money is. So we have quote unquote buying power, but our buying power is only a fraction of the money that white people actually have access to. Um, and we have to get to the point where we are defining freedom on our terms, where we are working these jobs on our terms, where we are, like where they have white labor unions and they have labor unions and the UAW and all this other stuff, the AFL-CIO. We need to have unions and organizations of our own that are teaching people how to branch out and be entrepreneurs, how to write business plans, how to go about getting their skills to market in a way that maximizes their black knowledge and our black dollars, instead of putting us in a position where we continue to fall back into this cycle of, okay, I want my baby to get a good job with a company so that they can take care of themselves. No, I want my babies to be educated enough to create jobs for other black people. And maybe that's a perspective shift that we have to have happen, because little white kids are not being taught just to get good jobs. The little white kids are being taught to open at least one business. You know what I'm saying? Whether it's AI or widget making or whatever. They're being taught to make jobs, and we need to teach our children to make jobs.
No, all facts, yo. I'll say, yo, shouts out to William Parker here, like in 1840s, 1850s, put
Hmm.
together the Self Defense Vigilante Committee, and black people 1800s, 1700s, created mutual aid societies and created organizations to help people, to train them how to get jobs and how to do things during slavery. You know what I'm saying? All this stuff that's you're reading is happening during slavery, where they created their own institutions even during that time, where there were specific laws against them creating their own institutions. They still put their finances and their resources together to be able to create, like, or to make a class to teach young black women how to be nurses, or how to sew, like, because at the time you can make money doing that, or teach young brothers carpentry, or teach them how to be a blacksmith or something like that. And there is no excuse that we can't do that right now, because they did that with way less and more against them than we did. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying.
And I agree with what you're saying, because if we don't defend ourselves, then we actually can't own and control the communities that we live in. We have to get to the point where we are defending the things that we create. So, as many of our ancestors have talked about, over the door of every black home should be a rifle, a shotgun, a 22. We should be able to arm and defend ourselves. We should be at the point in our history where we are defending and protecting those things that we create, including ourselves, our family, and our ideas. And we should understand, we should have a mechanism where we're able to understand trademark and copyright law. And it shouldn't just be one person in the hood that gets it, or one person in a corporate tower miles away that gets it, that charges us ridiculous amounts of money for that knowledge and information. That should be something that we're going to the library and accessing like a regular database, you know, and we can defend ourselves with these different mechanisms so that we're able to build up the strong community and organizations that we need to thrive and provide, like you said, for our children. Like you said, Brother Bakari talks about being able to have, excuse me, being able to have programs for these young kids that are on junior high school and in high school, not just having something that's for the prison population. See, the government will pay for the prison population to have these different programs, but we need to pay and organize so that we have something for the next generation, because they're not invested in our children. We have to invest in our children. And like you said, we have a history of doing mutual aid societies, but we have lost our way because so many of them have been robbed, they've been pillaged, somebody has run off with the money. And the only institution that it seems like we've been willing to invest in the past 100 years consistently has been the church. And the church is now corrupt. So unless you open a church that does these different things, that can have these different programs, you're kind of sort of on the outside, you're hustling backwards, because only the only institution most people are willing to invest in is the church, because they don't expect anything back. They expect spiritual fulfillment and enlightenment. They don't expect anything back. But to be a church that actually offers these programs and organizes these activities for the youth is a goal that I have. It's a desire that I have, so that people are actually getting something from this institution instead of just spiritual enlightenment and spiritual upliftment and encouragement. No, your own two hands can do for you what you're begging and asking God to do. God is there to do the things you can't do, which is nothing, because it says all things are possible to them that believe. So so let's put it in perspective. You're able to do this for yourself. instead of putting it into the hands of a higher power, the higher being that you can't touch, see, and that was beaten into you.
Yeah, well, that's facts. And the thing is though, like, you can't get people to listen to you or tell them what to do or any, because yeah, like you said, the trust is gone, and so I can't be like, hey, y'all, let's get together and y'all give me like $100 a piece, and we gonna make this whatever. Like, but at this point, like, we I think that because nobody will listen to you anyway unless you are feeding the people. Like, you don't need anything else to be able to reach the people, and you can talk to them and all of that stuff. But like you said, like if you're hungry, I'm not gonna really listen. I'm like, yo, you sound good. You like, that's nice. You know what I'm saying? Now I'll be right back while I go out here and get this whatever to eat. But
Hmm.
one thing that I realized, like, even you using, like, I know people who have a church, you know what I'm saying, and their church might have a out reach or something, or they might be able to do something that me as an individual couldn't do. And then I look at, like, okay, yo, I look around like, yo, this certain organization here, they call all of these grocery stores and stuff like that to be like, hey, I'm like, can I get all the food that y'all gonna throw away? Which for them is a tax write off, so they don't care. And then they do it, and then they give food back to communities. Now the problem is we don't have, like, all right, let's go to black people for urban communities and people in affected by food deserts in urban areas. You know what I'm saying? All the racist stuff that they say, because we know who those people are, right?
Hmm.
To
Hmm.
do that, and we can then reach out, use your certain organization to reach out, and then you can have this church backing you, so it looks like you, like, not to use it in a negative way. That's the thing, you got to use your power in the right way. But like, you have a church because you know somebody with a church who may be down with your plan, you know what I'm saying, and then you can feed the people, and then you can be like, well, look, while I'm doing this, I can talk to y'all about this, or look, I'm having this meeting at 7 o'clock where we're going to discuss how we can fix more stuff in our particular communities or stuff like that. So you can use your own stuff with other people with whatever they believe in, and to create, what I'm saying, what you need. But nobody will listen to you these days unless you are creating and doing something for the people. Because you got to remember, even back then, like, those people, like, with nothing, was creating opportunities to help other black people. They wasn't just asking for stuff, they was creating things to give them, um whether it be food, clothes, or money to bury their loved ones, you know what I'm saying? Or, and another thing, like, when they would lease their husbands out, like, because they talk about black slave owners, but like, Dred Scott wife would lease him out to work, you know what I'm saying, so they can have money as a family. And but it's just using your money and your stuff wisely. But I'll stop there. I'm going too long. I'm sorry.
You're never going too long. Don't self edit. I appreciate you. And you're right. She leased him out to generate money and revenue for the family because she was able to serve in a capacity that a white person served so that she could get money and resources in for the family to be supported. And we can't look past the fact that black women have often been the brains behind the engine, the back power, and the brawn that is the black man. And that's how our family dynamics have worked. But in the modern era, they've made the black woman think that she has to be the brawn and that she's now competing not so much with her man, but with the white man for dominance. And we are never in a position where we're actually competitive with them. We are always in a position where we are serving them in some capacity. Everything they give us is only in service of white supremacy. Like, they give us education, but they also give us debt, and they alienate us from our families, and they alienate us from our men. Carter G. Woodson talks about how an educated black person is alienated from their community. You know what I'm saying? And so these trinkets that they give us are often ways for them to isolate us and to put us in a position where we're more vulnerable. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks so much for tuning in. And we have to get to the point where we understand that these are all tricks. Everything that they are giving us, every opportunity that we have through them is just another trick for them to put us into a hole that further isolates us.
Yeah, facts. Absolutely. Absolutely. But yo, this system wasn't built overnight. It was built through generations and adjustments. So we could do the same thing. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. We can have black privilege. We want privilege too. So we want the privilege to walk around and be able to defend ourselves and not be killed. But it's still better to be judged by 12 than carried by six, as they say. So shouts out to my brother Anthony too.
Absolutely. But did you have other points that you wanted to highlight? Because this is, an excellent read. I appreciate you for writing this book and for allowing us to read it here at, the learning curve on our matron's curve, learning curve. Um, I value your insight and your intellect, and you have a brilliant mind that is putting forth all these different concepts and ideas, whether it's manifest destiny or relooking at how they consumed us during our enslavement, or looking at the different aspects of slavery and the way that they structured this system to work against us, and the way that they colluded the entire white community into this system of white supremacy, where they made it criminal to not be against black people, which is why anti-blackness is so prevalent today, because they make it criminal to be pro-black or to help black people.
Facts. They make it a criminal to defend yourself too. So
Hmm.
but it is, but no, I appreciate you for doing this, and I appreciate the added stuff that you can, because I just kept it like just to the basics. I ain't even add a lot of stuff because I would have been like, yeah, these don't believe the goddamn the good whites, but I gave them more credit, you know what I'm saying, than y'all. But I appreciate all the context that you add in your history, your knowledge of history, and your just knowledge as a whole, to where you can even be able to add, and especially stuff I don't even know. You know what I'm saying? I just saw the information, but you add the context too. So I appreciate this reading, and much love to you for doing this. So
Well, thank you. I want to thank you, Nicole Day by Day, KW Don 7, and Anthony McPhail for being here. I know that Koku is listening. Sister Ron, the elders are listening. I know that Bwana Haguziki is listening. I know that Brother Bakari is listening. Enrico Kane is listening. Jacqueline S. is listening. Kathy Redo 9002 is listening. Justin Liebert is listening. And so many others, and you. Yes, you, dear listener. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here and for tuning in to this show. We'll be back. We'll be back on Thursday with the final part of the history of racism, white supremacy by our own Forecast Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in. Peace, guys.
peace, y'all.